A millionaire accused two 6-year-old twins of extortion. But when the older boy spoke in court, his words left everyone in tears. The soft glow of moonlight filtered through the thin curtains of the small bedroom, casting gentle shadows on the twin beds where James and John lay awake. At 6 years old, they were mirror images of each other, both with tight curls, warm brown eyes, and hearts that seemed too big for their tiny frames. The only difference was the small birthmark near James's left ear, marking him as the older twin by 3 minutes. "James?" John whispered into the darkness, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ancient window fan. "You think Mama's going to be okay?" James rolled onto his side, facing his brother's bed. "Course she is. We're going to help her. Remember?" The floorboards creaked somewhere in their small apartment, and both boys fell silent. Their mother wouldn't be home for another hour. She was working late again at the Peterson house, trying to earn extra money for the rent. The sounds came from their elderly neighbor downstairs, whose television always seemed to be on, even in the middle of the night. "I saw her crying again," John continued, pulling his thin blanket up to his chin. "This morning, when she thought we were still sleeping. She was looking at those papers with the red stamps." James felt his chest tighten. He had seen those papers too, scattered across their small kitchen table. The word eviction stood out in bold letters, though neither twin fully understood what it meant. They just knew it made their mother cry, and that was enough to know it was bad. "Remember what we heard Tommy saying at school?" James sat up in his bed, excitement creeping into his voice. "About that rich man, Mr. Thompson? The one in the big white house." John nodded in the darkness. "The one who helps kids go to school?" "Yeah. Tommy said his cousin got to go to that fancy school because Mr. Thompson paid for it, and now his cousin's got new books and everything." The thought of new books made both boys' eyes light up. Their own school books were borrowed, and their backpacks had been purchased from a thrift store. Their mother always made sure they were clean and presentable, but they couldn't help noticing how different their things were from their classmates. A car passed by outside, its headlights sweeping across their room. For a moment, it illuminated the wall where their mother had hung their artwork, crayon drawings of their family, always just the three of them. James caught sight of the small desk they shared, where their homework lay incomplete. They'd run out of pencils again. What if? James hesitated, his heart racing with the enormity of his idea. What if we asked him, "Mr. Thompson?" John sat up too, his eyes wide. "You mean, go to his house?" "Why not? Mama always says being honest is important. We could tell him about school and how hard Mama works. Maybe he could help us too." A sudden bang from downstairs made both boys jump. It was followed by their neighbor's muffled voice complaining about the late-night TV commercials. "But what about?" John's voice trembled slightly. "What about what Daddy said? About asking for help?" The mention of their father hung heavy in the air. The last time they'd seen him, nearly a year ago, he'd promised to help with their school supplies. "Real men don't beg," he'd said proudly. "We take care of ourselves." He never came back after that. James slipped out of his bed and crossed the short distance to his brother's. The wooden floor was cool beneath his bare feet. "Mama says Daddy was wrong about lots of things," he whispered, climbing up beside John. "She says sometimes being brave means asking for help when you need it." John leaned against his twin's shoulder, drawing comfort from his presence. "You really think Mr. Thompson would listen to us?" "Only one way to find out." James wrapped an arm around his brother. "We gotta try, Johnny. For Mama." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the shadows dance on their wall. From somewhere in the distance, they could hear the sound of a siren, a common lullaby in their neighborhood. The fan continued its steady whir, barely cooling the warm spring air. "Okay," John finally whispered, "but we gotta do it right. Mama always says presentation is important when you meet new people." James grinned in the darkness. "Sunday," he declared, "after church. We'll wear our good clothes and everything." The sound of keys jingling in the front door made both boys scramble back to their own beds. Their mother's tired footsteps echoed through the apartment as she checked the locks one final time. "James?" John whispered once more, after their mother's footsteps had faded. "Yeah, I'm scared." James stared up at the ceiling, where the streetlight created patterns through their window. "Me too," he admitted. "But remember what Mama says about being scared?" Both boys whispered together, in perfect unison. Being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you are scared. As their mother's gentle humming drifted from the kitchen, where she was undoubtedly counting the day's earnings, the twins finally closed their eyes. James lay awake long after John's breathing had evened out, his young mind filled with visions of the white mansion at the end of their street. In his imagination, it wasn't as intimidating as it looked during the day. In his dreams, it was a place where help lived, waiting for those brave enough to ask for it. He fell asleep planning how they would prepare for Sunday, completely unaware that their innocent decision would soon turn their whole world upside down. Sunday afternoon arrived with unusual clarity, the kind that makes everything seem sharper and more significant. James and John stood at their bedroom window, watching the white mansion that loomed at the end of their street. They had put on their church clothes, matching blue button-down shirts and khaki pants that their mother had carefully ironed that morning. "You boys sure you don't want to come to MS? Martinez is with me," their mother called from the kitchen. "She's making her special Domingo soup." James squeezed his brother's hand. "No thank you, Mama. We're going to study for our spelling test tomorrow." "Such good boys," she said, appearing in their doorway. Despite her exhaustion, she smiled, straightening John's slightly crooked collar. "I'll be back in 2 hours. Lock the door behind me." "Okay." They waited until they heard her footsteps fade down the stairs, then counted to 100 just to be sure. James checked their appearance one last time in the mirror. They had used water to smooth down their curls, and their faces shone from vigorous washing. "Ready?" James asked, though his own heart was hammering. John nodded, his grip on James's hand tightening. "Ready?" The walk to Mr. Thompson's mansion felt longer than it ever had before. Each step down their street seemed to echo with importance. They passed Mrs. Wilson watering her small patch of flowers, and she gave them a curious look but said nothing. The twins walked with purposeful dignity, just as their mother had taught them. As they approached the iron gates of the Thompson estate, the mansion seemed to grow even larger. Unlike the other houses on their street, it sat back from the road, protected by a magnificent garden that bloomed with roses and carefully manicured shrubs. "Look," John whispered, pointing to a small sign near the gate. "It says Thompson Family Foundation." James nodded, remembering what Tommy had said about Mr. Thompson helping kids. "See? This is the right place." The gates were open, as they usually were on Sundays. The twins started up the long driveway, their dress shoes crunching against the gravel. Each step felt heavier than the last. "Maybe we should go back," John suggested, his voice trembling slightly. James shook his head. "Remember what Mama says about finishing what you start?" They both recited in whispers. Half-done things are same as not done at all. The front door of the mansion was enormous, made of dark wood with intricate carvings. A brass knocker hung, at adult height, well above their reach. The twins stood there for a moment, gathering their courage. "What if he's mean?" John asked. "Tommy said he's nice," James reassured him, though his own voice wavered. "And look how pretty his garden is. I mean, people don't have pretty gardens." Finally, James reached up and pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed somewhere deep inside the house, making both boys jump. They waited, holding hands, their hearts pounding in perfect synchronization. The door opened slowly, revealing a tall, elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Mr. Thompson looked exactly as James had imagined a rich person would look, wearing a sweater that seemed softer than anything the twins had ever seen. "Well, hello there, Mr. Thompson said, crouching down to their level. His voice was warm, like honey and tea. "What brings two young gentlemen to my door today?" The twins glanced at each other. They had practiced this part, but now the words seemed stuck in their throats. James spoke first, his voice small but clear. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm James, and this is my brother John. We wanted to ask you something important." Mr. Thompson's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Very formal. I appreciate good manners. Would you like to come inside? I believe Mrs. Henderson just made some fresh lemonade." The boys stepped into a foyer larger than their entire apartment. Everything gleamed: the marble floor, the crystal chandelier, the gilded mirror on the wall. Their reflections stared back at them, two small dark figures in a world of light and shine. "Now then, Mr. Thompson said, leading them to a sunny room filled with comfortable-looking furniture. "What's this important question?" James took a deep breath. "Sir, we heard that you help kids go to school, that you make it possible for them to have new books and proper supplies and everything." "That's true, Mr. Thompson nodded, settling into an armchair. "The Thompson Foundation provides educational assistance to children in need." "Well, sir," James continued, standing as straight as he could, "we wanted to ask." The sharp sound of a car door slamming cut through the air. Footsteps approached rapidly, and a younger man burst into the room. He was wearing an expensive suit, his face flushed with what looked like anger. "Dad, I've been calling you all morning. Why aren't you answering your—" The man stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the twins. "What's going on here?" "Robert, Mr. Thompson said calmly. "These young men were just about to tell me something important." Robert Thompson's expression darkened. "Were they now?" He moved closer, looming over the boys. "And how exactly did you two get in here?" "The gates were open," John whispered, shrinking behind his brother. "Of course they were." Robert's voice was cold. "And I suppose you just walked right up to the door? No adults with you?" James felt his brother trembling beside him. "Our mama doesn't know we're here," he admitted. "We just wanted to ask about school help." "School help?" Robert laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. "Dad, don't you see what's happening here? This is obviously a setup. Where are your parents? Who sent you?" Mr. Thompson stood slowly, concern crossing his features. "Robert, they're just children. Children can be used, Dad. Remember the Martinez scandal? The Rogers lawsuit?" Robert pulled out his phone. "What did you say your last name was?" The twins backed away, their carefully prepared words forgotten in the face of Robert's hostile questioning. "I think," James said, his voice shaking but determined, "we should go home now." "Oh, you're not going anywhere until we get some answers," Robert declared, already typing on his phone. "Address? Parents' name?" "Robert." "Mr. Thompson's sharp voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." But the damage was done. The twins were already backing toward the door, their shoes squeaking on the polished floor. James grabbed John's hand and turned, pulling his brother with him as they fled from the mansion. They ran down the long driveway, their church shoes slipping on the gravel, the sound of raised voices fading behind them. They didn't stop running until they reached their own street, their clothes disheveled and their carefully smoothed hair wild from the wind. "James," John gasped, tears streaming down his face. "What did we do wrong?" James pulled his brother into a hug, his own heart racing. "Nothing," he whispered, though doubt had already begun to creep into his mind. "We didn't do anything wrong." But as they walked slowly back to their apartment, both boys could feel that something had changed. The weight of their dreams had suddenly become much heavier, and neither of them could shake the feeling that their innocent plan had somehow set something terrible in motion. They didn't know it yet, but Robert Thompson was already making phone calls, and by tomorrow, their small world would begin to crumble around them. The twins made it home just minutes before their mother returned from Ms. Martinez's. They had barely finished changing out of their church clothes when they heard her key in the lock. Their hearts were still racing, but they forced casual smiles as she entered. "My sweet boys," she said, setting down her purse. "Did you get much studying done?" The lie sat heavy in James's stomach. "Yes, Mama," he managed, while John became suddenly fascinated with his socks. Their mother, Sarah Williams, had always been able to read her sons like open books. She paused, her dark eyes scanning their faces. "Is everything okay?" "Just tired," James said quickly. "From all the studying." Sarah's gaze lingered a moment longer, but she didn't press further. "Well, get some rest. Tomorrow's a big day, Mrs. Peterson wants me to clean her whole house before her dinner party." That night, neither twin could sleep. The encounter at the mansion played over and over in their minds, Robert Thompson's hostile voice echoing in their thoughts. Around midnight, they heard their mother crying again, the sound muffled by her pillow in the next room. "James?" John whispered. Should we tell Mama? Before James could answer, a notification ping came from their mother's phone in the kitchen. Then another, and another. The next morning arrived with an unusual tension in the air. Sarah was already up when the twins emerged from their room, staring at her phone with a pale face. Mama? James approached cautiously. What's wrong? She looked up, and for a moment, she seemed lost for words. Mrs. Peterson she canceled our arrangement. Through text, she swallowed hard. She said she won't be needing my services anymore. But why? John asked, his small face scrunched in confusion. Sarah shook her head, forcing a smile. Never mind that. Let's get you boys ready for school. But school brought its own challenges. As they walked through the gates, they noticed parents pulling their children closer, whispered conversations stopping abruptly as they passed. During first period, James overheard two teachers talking outside the classroom door. Those are the Williams twins, one whispered. Did you hear what happened? The Thompson incident? It's all over the neighborhood Facebook group. Apparently, they tried to. The door closed, cutting off the rest of the conversation. But James felt his cheeks burn with shame. At lunch, he found John sitting alone at their usual table, his sandwich untouched. Tommy won't talk to me anymore, John said quietly. His mom told him we're bad kids. James sat down beside his brother, their shoulders touching. We're not bad kids, he insisted, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. The afternoon brought more whispers, more avoided gazes. When their mother picked them up, her eyes were red-rimmed, and her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. Mama, James started as they walked home. We need to tell you something. But before he could continue, Mrs. Wilson, their neighbor who had seen them walking to the mansion, approached with a stern expression. Sarah, she said, her voice carrying across the street. I think we need to talk about what your boys did yesterday. Sarah stopped walking, her grip tightening on the twins' hands. What do you mean? I saw them, Mrs. Wilson declared, walking to the Thompson mansion in their Sunday best. And now the whole neighborhood's talking about how they tried to scam poor Mr. Thompson. The color drained from Sarah's face as she turned to look at her sons. Is this true? James felt tears welling up in his eyes. We just wanted to ask for help with school, he whispered, like Tommy's cousin got. That evening, their small apartment felt even smaller as Sarah sat the twins down at their kitchen table. Her hands trembled as she showed them her phone. Dozens of messages from her cleaning clients, all canceling their services. They're saying, her voice broke. They're saying I sent you there to extort money from Mr. Thompson, that I'm using my own children to. She couldn't finish the sentence. John burst into tears, and James felt like his world was spinning out of control. We just wanted to help, he explained desperately. We heard you crying about the bills, and everyone says Mr. Thompson helps kids, and we thought. Sarah pulled both boys into a tight hug, her own tears falling into their curly hair. Oh, my babies, my sweet, brave, foolish babies. The moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Sarah wiped her eyes and went to answer it, the twins clinging to each other at the table. Through the crack in the door, they could see a man in a suit holding an official-looking envelope. M.S. Williams? This is a notice regarding the incident at the Thompson estate yesterday. You'll be hearing from our lawyers. That night, after their mother thought they were asleep, the twins heard her on the phone with their aunt in another state. I don't know what to do, Lisa, she sobbed quietly. They're canceling all my jobs. The rent's already late, and now this legal notice. Maybe the boys would be better off with you for a while. In their shared bedroom, James and John lay in their beds, silent tears rolling down their cheeks. The weight of their innocent mistake crashed down around them, threatening to tear apart the only world they'd ever known. I'm sorry, James whispered into the darkness. This is all my fault. It was my idea. John's response came through quiet sobs. We both decided. Together, outside their window, the white mansion stood unchanged in the distance, its windows glowing warmly in the night. But now it seemed less like a beacon of hope and more like a monument to their shattered dreams. As they drifted into uneasy sleep, neither twin knew that the worst was yet to come, or that salvation would arrive in the most unexpected way through the simple words of a child's letter. The next few days unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare. Sarah's phone had stopped ringing with the usual cleaning job calls, replaced by a deafening silence, broken only by cancellation messages. By Wednesday morning, even Mrs. Jenkins, her most loyal client of 3 years, had sent a politely worded text ending their arrangement. "It's just not a good time," the message read. "Nothing personal, you understand, but it was personal." Everything had become personal since that fateful Sunday afternoon. Sarah stood in their small kitchen, staring at the nearly empty refrigerator. The twins watched from the doorway as she counted and recounted the meager bills in her wallet, her lips moving silently. "Mama," James spoke softly, "we don't need milk this week." She turned, startled to find them watching. "Of course you need milk. Growing boys need." Her voice caught, and she quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. At school, the situation had deteriorated further. During recess, James and John sat on their usual bench, watching other children play games they were no longer invited to join. "Hey, beggar boys!" A harsh voice cut through their isolation. Marcus, a third grader known for his mean streak, approached with several other boys. "My mom says your mom is using you to steal from rich people." John shrunk closer to his brother, but James sat up straighter. "That's not true." "Really?" Marcus sneered. "Then why were you at Mr. Thompson's house? Everyone knows your mom can't afford anything. She's just a cleaning lady. Don't talk about our mama like that." James stood up, his small fist clenched. "Or what? You'll try to steal from my family, too?" The first push caught James off guard, sending him stumbling backward. John jumped up to help, but another boy held him back. James regained his balance, remembering their mother's words about fighting, but also remembering her words about standing up for what's right. "We're not thieves," James declared, his voice steady despite his fear. "We just wanted to go to school like everyone else." Marcus laughed. "Well, you might not have to worry about that soon. I heard they're sending you away." The words hit harder than any push could have. That morning, James had found a printed bus schedule on their mother's bedside table, with routes to their aunt's city circled in red pen. A teacher's whistle broke through the confrontation, sending the bullies scattering. But their words lingered, heavy in the afternoon air. That evening, while their mother was in the bathroom, John found James in their bedroom, silently packing his small backpack. "What are you doing?" John asked, though he already knew the answer. James looked up, his eyes red but determined. "If we leave first, Mama won't have to send us away. We can find Dad. He promised he'd help, remember?" John sat on his bed, hugging his knees. "Dad promises lots of things." The sound of their mother crying drifted through the thin walls. She was on the phone again, probably with their aunt. "I can't even afford groceries this week," they heard her sob. The landlord's threatening eviction, and now this lawsuit. James abandoned his packing and climbed onto John's bed, wrapping an arm around his twin. They sat in silence, listening to their mother's muffled tears, each lost in thoughts too heavy for their young hearts. "Remember when Dad left?" John whispered. "He said he was going to buy us those new shoes we wanted." James nodded. They'd waited by the window all day, excited about the promised shoes. Their mother had found them asleep there, still waiting. That was the last time they'd seen their father. "We can't leave Mama," James finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "She needs us." A knock at their door made both boys jump. Sarah entered, her eyes puffy, but her smile brave. "Time for bed, my loves." As she tucked them in, John caught her hand. "Mama, are you going to send us away?" Sarah's composure cracked. She sat heavily on John's bed, gathering both boys into her arms. "Listen to me," she said firmly, despite her trembling voice. "You are my heart walking around outside my body. Nothing, no lawsuit, no gossip, no empty bank account will ever make me send you away. We're a family. We stick together." "But what about Aunt Lisa?" James asked. "That was just me being scared," Sarah admitted, smoothing their curls. "And sometimes when grown-ups are scared, we think about things we'd never actually do." She held them close, humming their favorite lullaby, the same one her mother had sung to her. The familiar melody filled their small bedroom, pushing back the shadows of worry for a moment. "Mama," James said suddenly, "I have a confession." Sarah waited patiently as James gathered his courage. We didn't really study that Sunday. We went to Mr. Thompson's house because his voice wavered, because we saw you crying about the bills. We thought if we asked nicely like Tommy's cousin did, maybe he'd help us go to a good school. Then you wouldn't have to work so hard. Fresh tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she pulled them closer. Oh, my sweet, sweet boys. You don't have to fix everything for me. That's my job, to take care of you. But who takes care of you, Mama? John asked. Sarah smiled through her tears. We take care of each other. That's what families do. Later that night, after Sarah had fallen into an exhausted sleep, the twins lay awake in their beds. The distant sound of sirens mixed with their neighbor's television, creating a familiar urban lullaby. James, John whispered, do you think Mr. Thompson knows the truth? I don't know, James replied. But his son was so angry. Maybe if we could explain? Maybe. But both boys knew that in the adult world, explanations weren't always enough. Sometimes innocence itself wasn't enough. As they drifted off to sleep, their dreams were filled with white mansions that grew taller and more frightening, and doors that kept closing before they could speak the truth. In the darkness, their mother's lullaby echoed in their memory. Hold on tight, my little lights. The storm will pass, the sun will rise. They just had to hold on until then. The crisp click of expensive shoes echoed through the elementary school hallway as Robert Thompson walked beside Principal Martinez. His leather briefcase gleamed under the fluorescent lights, matching his perfectly pressed suit. I appreciate your cooperation in this matter, Robert said, his voice professionally smooth. We need to understand the full scope of this situation. Principal Martinez nodded uncomfortably. The Williams twins have always been exemplary students. Their mother, Robert interrupted, is precisely why we're here. In the classroom, James and John sat at their desks, trying to focus on their math worksheets. But the whispers had started again, this time about the important-looking man who'd arrived in a sleek black car. Mrs. Anderson, a voice crackled over the intercom. Please send James Williams to the principal's office. The classroom fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned to James, who slowly stood, his chair scraping against the floor. As he walked to the door, he caught John's terrified gaze. It'll be okay, he mouthed to his brother, trying to convince himself as much as John. The principal's office had always seemed big to James, but today it felt enormous. Robert Thompson sat in one of the chairs, his legs crossed casually, while Principal Martinez stood by her desk, her usual warm smile replaced by a worried frown. Hello, James, Robert said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Do you know who I am? James nodded, his throat tight. Yes, sir. You're Mr. Thompson's son. That's right. And I'd like to ask you some questions about Sunday afternoon. About why you and your brother came to our house. Before James could answer, the office door opened again. A woman in a navy blazer entered, introducing herself as Ms. Chun from Social Services. James, she said kindly, sitting next to him. We just want to understand what's happening at home. Is anyone telling you to do things you don't want to do? No, ma'am, James replied firmly. We just wanted. Come now, Robert interrupted. Surely your mother must have known about your visit? Perhaps, suggested it. James felt tears burning behind his eyes, but refused to let them fall. It was my idea. Mama didn't know. She works really hard, and we just wanted to help by asking for money. Robert's voice sharpened. No. James stood up suddenly, surprising everyone in the room. We wanted to ask about school, like Tommy's cousin. We never asked for money. Principal Martinez stepped forward. Mr. Thompson, I think that's enough. He's just a child. But Robert wasn't finished. He pulled out a folder, spreading photographs across the desk, pictures of the twins approaching the mansion, their mother at various cleaning jobs, their apartment building. You been watching us? James whispered, his voice small. We need to be thorough, Robert replied coolly. Your mother's financial situation, her employment history, your father's absence. In the classroom, John sat rigid in his chair, unable to focus on his work. The minutes ticked by like hours until finally, James returned. His brother's face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. John Williams, the intercom crackled again. Please come to the principal's office." The rest of the day passed in a blur of questions, accusations, and barely contained tears. By the time school ended, both boys were emotionally exhausted. Their mother was waiting outside, looking equally drained. She'd been called away from her last remaining cleaning job, the small church office, to answer questions from social services. "Mama," John broke down as soon as they were home. "They asked about Dad, about why he left. They think you made us do it." Sarah pulled both boys close, her own composure cracking. "Listen to me," she said fiercely. "They can investigate all they want. We have nothing to hide. Nothing." But the investigation continued to ripple through their lives. The next morning, their neighbor Mrs. Wilson was more than happy to tell Robert Thompson about every time she'd seen Sarah come home late from work, every time the boys had been alone in the apartment. "And they're always running around barefoot," she added, though she failed to mention it was usually while playing in the sprinklers on hot days. At the church office, Sarah's hands trembled as she cleaned, aware of the questioning looks from the staff. By afternoon, even this last job had slipped away, just until things settled down, they said. The final blow came when they returned home to find an official notice taped to their door. The eviction warning had become an eviction order. "How can they?" Sarah whispered, reading the notice for the third time. "We've always paid rent, even if sometimes it was late." The landlord's worried about the lawsuit. Their next-door neighbor explained through the thin walls. "Says he can't risk the liability." That night, as Sarah made dinner with their last box of macaroni and cheese, John had a panic attack, his first since their father left. His small body shook with sobs as he gasped for air, terrified by the thought of losing their home. "Breathe with me, baby," Sarah coached, holding him close. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Like we practiced." James stood in the doorway, watching his brother struggle to breathe, watching his mother fight to stay strong. Something hard and determined settled in his chest. Later, after John had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, James sat at their small desk with a pencil and paper. The words wouldn't come easily, they never did, but he kept writing, erasing, and writing again. "Dear Mr. Thompson," he began, his childish handwriting wobbly but determined. "I know you think we're bad people, but we're not. We just wanted—" He worked late into the night, pouring his heart onto the paper, trying to find the words that would make things right. In the morning, he would have to find a way to deliver it. As he wrote, outside their window, Robert Thompson sat in his car, watching their apartment building, making notes about lights on past bedtime, adding another mark to his growing file of evidence against the Williams family. But he couldn't see what was most important: the love that filled the small apartment, the strength that bound the small family together, or the hope that still lived in the heart of a 6-year-old boy who refused to give up. The night before the court hearing stretched endlessly before the Williams family. Sarah stood in front of their small closet, running her hands over the twins' only dress shirts, the blue ones they'd worn that fateful Sunday. They would have to wear them again tomorrow. There was no money for new ones. "Mama," James called from their bedroom. "Can you help me with something?" Sarah found him sitting at their desk, surrounded by crumpled papers. In front of him lay a single sheet, covered in his careful handwriting. "What's this, baby?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. James quickly covered the paper. It's private. I just need help spelling something." "How do you spell forgiveness?" he asked, his voice small. Sarah's heart clenched, but she spelled it out slowly, watching as he carefully wrote each letter. She wanted to read what he'd written, but something in his expression made her hold back. In the kitchen, John was attempting to iron their shirts, standing on a chair to reach the small ironing board. "I can do that, sweetheart," Sarah offered. John shook his head determinedly. "You always say presentation is important. I want us to look perfect tomorrow." Sarah watched her youngest son, by 3 minutes as he always reminded everyone, carefully pressing the shirts, his tongue stuck out in concentration. These beautiful boys, trying so hard to be grown up, to fix things that weren't their responsibility to fix. Around midnight, after Sarah had finally gone to bed, James slipped out of his bed. The letter was finished. He'd worked on it all week, pouring every ounce of truth and hope he could muster into the words. "Where are you going?" John whispered, sitting up in his bed. "I have to take this to Mr. Thompson's house, James replied, folding the letter carefully. Before tomorrow. John was out of bed immediately. I'm coming with you. No, James said firmly. One of us needs to stay with Mama. Just in case she wakes up. The brothers stared at each other in the dim light from the street lamp outside their window. Finally, John nodded, understanding the wisdom in James's words. Promise you'll be careful? John asked, hugging his brother tightly. Promise. And John? If? James swallowed hard. If something happens tomorrow, if they try to separate us, remember what Mama said. We stick together no matter what. James crept through the quiet apartment, his heart pounding with each creak of the old floorboards. At the front door, he paused, listening to the familiar sounds of their home. The humming refrigerator, their mother's soft breathing, the distant sound of their neighbor's television. The night air was cool against his face as he made his way down the street. The white mansion looked different in the pre-dawn darkness, less intimidating somehow, more like a regular house. The gates were closed, but James found a gap just big enough for his small body to squeeze through. His bare feet made no sound on the gravel driveway as he approached the front door. The letter felt heavy in his hands, weighted with all his hopes and fears. Please, he whispered, slipping the letter under the door. Please read it. Back at home, John was waiting by the window. The brothers didn't speak as James climbed back into bed. They didn't need to. Years of being twins had taught them when silence said more than words ever could. Morning arrived too quickly. Sarah helped the twins dress in their freshly ironed shirts, her hands trembling as she buttoned their collars. Remember, she said, kneeling before them, no matter what happens today, I love you more than anything in this world. We're going to get through this together. They ate breakfast in silence, their last few slices of bread with peanut butter. Sarah had saved just enough gas in the car to get them to the courthouse. As they prepared to leave, their neighbors watched from their windows. Some with pity, others with judgment, but none with the kindness they'd shown just weeks ago. Mama, John asked as they walked to the car. What's going to happen today? Sarah paused, looking down at her boys. So young to be facing something so serious. I don't know, baby. But what I do know is that the truth is on our side. And in the end, truth always matters. James touched the spot on his chest where he'd memorized every word of his letter. He hadn't told his mother or even John what he'd written. Some things needed to stay in your heart until the right moment. As they drove to the courthouse, the morning sun cast long shadows across the street. They passed Mr. Thompson's mansion, and James saw something that made his heart skip. The letter was gone from where he'd slid it under the door. The courthouse loomed before them, its stone steps seeming to stretch endlessly upward. Sarah parked the car, then turned to face her sons. Before we go in, she said, her voice steady despite her fear, I want you to know something. Whatever happens in there, whatever anyone says about us, we know who we are. We're the Williams family. We take care of each other. We tell the truth. And we never, ever give up. The twins nodded, holding hands as they always did in moments of fear or uncertainty. One more thing, Sarah added, reaching back to straighten their collars one last time. I am so proud of you both. Not just today, but every day. You are the best things that ever happened to me. As they climbed the courthouse steps, James squeezed his brother's hand 3 times. Their secret code for I love you. John squeezed back 4 times. I love you too. Inside, they could see Mr. Thompson sitting with his son Robert, who was shuffling through papers. Mr. Thompson looked up as they entered, and for a moment, his hand moved to his jacket pocket, where James could see the corner of a folded piece of paper. The truth was about to be heard, one way or another. The courtroom seemed impossibly large to the twins, with its high ceilings and rows of wooden benches. They sat beside their mother, their freshly pressed shirts already wrinkled from nervous fidgeting. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Mr. Thompson sat in the front row, occasionally reaching into his jacket pocket to touch something, a gesture James noticed each time. Robert Thompson stood at the prosecutor's table, arranging papers with precise movements. All rise, the bailiff called out. The Honorable Judge Catherine Martinez presiding. As everyone stood, John wobbled slightly, steadied by his brother's hand. The judge, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, took her seat and surveyed the room. We're here today regarding case number 2024 CV 1847, Thompson v. Williams, she began. Before we proceed, I understand Mr. Thompson has something to address the court? James watched as Mr. Thompson slowly stood, pulling from his pocket the very letter he'd slipped under the door that morning. The paper was worn now, as if it had been read many times. Your Honor, Mr. Thompson said, his voice wavering slightly. I received this letter early this morning. I believe it's relevant to these proceedings. Robert Thompson's head snapped up. Dad, we haven't had time to review any new evidence. This isn't evidence, Robert, Mr. Thompson interrupted gently. This is truth, written by a child. The judge nodded. Please proceed, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson unfolded the letter, his hands trembling slightly as he began to read. Dear Mr. Thompson, my name is James Williams. I'm the boy who came to your house with my twin brother John. I know you think we're bad people, but we're not. We just wanted to help our mama. Every night, we hear her crying about bills. She works so hard cleaning other people's houses until her hands are red and sore. Sometimes she doesn't eat dinner, so we can have enough. We heard about how you help kids go to school. Tommy in our class said his cousin got to go to a good school because of you. We thought maybe if we asked nicely, you might help us too. Mama didn't know we went to your house. She always taught us to be honest and work hard. She says education is the key to a better life. That's why we wanted to ask about school, not money. Your son thinks Mama told us to come, but she didn't. It was my idea. If someone needs to be in trouble, it should be me, not Mama or John. When our daddy left, he said real men don't ask for help. But Mama says being brave means doing what's right, even when you're scared. I'm really scared right now, Mr. Thompson. Not for me, but for Mama and John. I want to be a teacher someday, so I can help other kids like you do. John wants to be a doctor. We study hard, even though our books are old and we sometimes run out of pencils. I'm sorry if we made you angry or scared. We didn't mean to. We just wanted a chance to learn like other kids. Please don't make us leave our home. Please don't take Mama's jobs away. She's the best mama in the world, and she didn't do anything wrong. If you read this letter, thank you. Mama says thank you is always important, even when you're sad. Sincerely, James Williams, age 6, and 3 minutes older than John. The courtroom fell silent as Mr. Thompson finished reading. Sarah had tears streaming down her face, and even Robert Thompson stood motionless, his carefully prepared arguments forgotten. Young man, the judge said, looking directly at James. Would you like to say anything to the court? James stood, his legs shaking, but his voice clear. Everything in that letter is true. My brother and I just wanted to go to school and help our mama. That's all. And you wrote this letter yourself? The judge asked. Yes, ma'am. It took me all week because spelling is hard. But Mama always says if something's important, you keep trying until you get it right. The judge turned to Mr. Thompson. And your thoughts on this matter? Mr. Thompson looked at the twins, then at Sarah, his eyes filled with understanding. Your Honor, I'd like to withdraw all charges. These boys, they remind me of myself at their age. My own father worked 3 jobs to send me to school. I've forgotten what it's like to be young and desperate for an education. Robert Thompson started to protest, but his father held up a hand. Enough, Robert. We've caused enough pain to this family. The judge nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. Very well. Case dismissed. Sarah pulled her boys close, crying openly now. Around them, the tension in the courtroom dissolved, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. Mr. Thompson approached their bench, still holding James's letter. Ms. Williams, he said softly, I owe you and your boys an apology. And, perhaps, a conversation about educational opportunities? Before Sarah could respond, Robert Thompson stepped forward, his face flushed. Dad, you can't be serious. I've never been more serious, Mr. Thompson interrupted. These boys reminded me why I started the foundation in the first place. Not for recognition or tax benefits, but to help children who dream of education despite their circumstances. As they spoke, James and John held hands, watching the adults with wide eyes. The morning sun had risen higher, and now the courtroom was filled with warm light, as if the very room was sighing with relief. The truth had finally been heard, carried on the wings of a child's letter and delivered by the pure heart that wrote it. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows as Mr. Thompson formally withdrew his complaint. The tension that had suffocated the room just moments before dissipated with each word he spoke. Furthermore, Mr. Thompson added, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, I'd like to issue a public statement clearing the Williams family of any wrongdoing. Robert Thompson stood rigid beside his father, his perfectly pressed suit suddenly seeming to weigh heavily on his shoulders. His eyes moved from the twins to his case files, then back to the boys' hopeful faces. Dad, he said quietly, something shifting in his expression. May I speak? Mr. Thompson nodded, and Robert stepped forward, facing Sarah and the twins. Gone was the cold prosecutor from moments before. In his place stood a man who looked suddenly uncertain, almost vulnerable. M.S. Williams, he began, then paused to clear his throat. I owe you and your sons an apology. A profound one. He turned to face the twins directly. Especially you boys. I let fear and suspicion cloud my judgment. I forgot what it was like to be a child with dreams. John pressed closer to James, both brothers watching Robert with cautious hope. Sarah kept her arms protectively around her sons, but nodded for Robert to continue. You see, Robert's voice softened. When I was about your age, someone tried to take advantage of my father's generosity. It changed how I saw the world. I became so focused on protecting our family that I forgot what the foundation was truly about. Mr. Thompson placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. We both lost sight of what matters most. The judge, who had been watching the scene unfold, spoke up. Given the circumstances, I believe some restitution is in order. Mr. Thompson, your actions, though well-intentioned, have caused significant hardship for this family. Yes, Your Honor, Mr. Thompson agreed immediately. Robert and I have discussed this. We'd like to help make things right. Sarah straightened her spine. We don't want charity, she said firmly. Just our dignity back. Not charity. M.S. Williams, Mr. Thompson smiled warmly. Opportunity. The kind these bright young men came seeking in the first place. Robert stepped forward again, this time pulling out his phone. I've already contacted your former employers. They'll be receiving a formal letter explaining the misunderstanding. Your job should be restored by tomorrow. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. And Mr. Thompson added, the foundation would be honored to offer both James and John full educational scholarships, including supplies and uniforms, through high school graduation. The twins' eyes widened, but it was James who spoke first. Really? We can go to school? A good school? The very best, Mr. Thompson assured him. Tommy's cousin goes there too. John tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mama, can we? Sarah looked at her sons' hopeful faces, then back at the Thompsons. This is overwhelming. There's one more thing, Robert said, his voice gentle now. The church office called this morning. They're offering you a full-time position as their administrative assistant. Better hours, better pay, and health insurance for the family. The courtroom, which had been silent during this exchange, suddenly erupted in soft murmurs. The judge tapped her gavel lightly. Well, she smiled. It seems justice has been served in the most unexpected way. M.S. Williams, do you accept these terms? Sarah pulled her boys closer, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Your Honor. We do. As they prepared to leave the courtroom, Robert Thompson approached James one last time. Your letter, he said softly. It reminded me of something my father once told me. The truest wealth is measured not in dollars, but in the dreams we help others achieve. He knelt down to the boy's level. Thank you for teaching me that lesson again. Outside the courthouse, the spring air felt lighter somehow. Sarah stood on the steps with her boys, blinking in the sunlight, still processing the morning's events. Mr. Thompson approached them one last time. "Ms. Williams, would you and the boys join us for lunch? There's much to discuss about their educational future." For the first time in weeks, Sarah's smile reached her eyes. "We'd be honored." As they walked to their cars, John tugged on James's sleeve. "You did it, James. Your letter fixed everything." James squeezed his brother's hand. "We did it together. We always do everything together." Behind them, Robert watched the twins with newfound understanding. He turned to his father, his voice quiet. "Dad, I think I finally understand why you started the foundation." "Mr." Thompson smiled, patting his son's shoulder. "Sometimes it takes a child's wisdom to remind us of our own humanity." The two families drove to a nearby restaurant, the morning's events having transformed them all. The twins sat in the back seat of their mother's car, still holding hands, their pressed shirts now completely wrinkled, but their hearts fuller than ever. Through the car window, they could see the city stretching out before them, no longer a place of closed doors and harsh judgments, but a world of new possibilities. The white mansion at the end of their street would no longer loom as a symbol of what they couldn't have, but stand as a reminder of what courage, truth, and an open heart could achieve. Sarah caught her son's eyes in the rearview mirror and smiled. "I'm so proud of you both," she said softly. "So very proud." The twins smiled back, their future suddenly as bright as the spring sun overhead. Sometimes, they had learned, the biggest dreams come true not through grand gestures, but through the simple, honest words of a child's heart. 3 months had passed since that transformative day in the courtroom. The morning sun filtered through new curtains in the Williams apartment, a small luxury Sarah had allowed herself after her first paycheck from the church office. The twins stood before their mirror, adjusting their new school uniforms. Crisp white shirts, navy blazers with the academy's crest, and perfectly pressed gray slacks. "Stop fidgeting with your tie," James told John, reaching over to straighten it. "Mama showed us 3 times how to do it right." Sarah watched from the doorway, her heart full. The church job had been everything Robert Thompson promised and more. Regular hours meant she could drop off and pick up the boys from school herself. Health insurance meant no more worrying about doctor visits. And the steady salary meant no more choosing between groceries and electricity. "Boys, time for breakfast," she called out, heading to their small but well-stocked kitchen. No more empty refrigerator, no more counting slices of bread. As they ate their breakfast, a knock at the door surprised them. Sarah opened it to find Mr. Thompson standing there, his kind face beaming. "Good morning. I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "I just wanted to see the boys off on their first day at the academy." The twins rushed to greet him, their excitement palpable. Over the past months, Mr. Thompson had become a regular visitor, taking a personal interest in their education and well-being. "Mr. Thompson," John exclaimed, "look at our uniforms." "Very sharp, Mr. Thompson nodded approvingly. "You know, I wore the same uniform when I was your age, though I dare say you wear it better." Sarah invited him in for coffee, a morning ritual that had developed naturally. As she poured him a cup, he pulled out 2 small packages from his briefcase. "A little first-day present for our newest scholars," he said, handing one to each twin. Inside, they found brand-new watches, simple but elegant, with the Academy's motto engraved on the back. "Knowledge lights the way. Now you'll always be on time for class, Mr. Thompson winked. "Speaking of which, we should get going. Robert's waiting at the school to help show you around." The mention of Robert brought smiles to everyone's faces. His transformation over the past months had been remarkable. The hard-edged lawyer had softened, particularly around the twins. He'd even started a new program at the foundation specifically focused on helping single-parent families. The drive to the academy was filled with nervous excitement. As they pulled up to the impressive buildings, they saw Robert waiting on the steps, along with a familiar face, Tommy, their former classmate who'd first told them about Mr. Thompson's help. "James! John!" Tommy called out, waving enthusiastically. "We're in the same class." Sarah watched as her boys rushed to join their friend, their earlier nervousness forgotten. Robert approached her car, looking nothing like the stern prosecutor from that courtroom day. "Ms. Williams," he greeted warmly. "Dad and I will make sure they get settled in." Will you be okay at your new job? Sarah nodded, touched by his concern. The church staff has been wonderful. Sister Margaret even helped me set up a college savings account for the boys. Speaking of savings, Robert smiled. The foundation's board approved my proposal. We're starting a parent education program. Full scholarships for single parents who want to earn their degrees. I hope you'll consider applying. Sarah's eyes welled with tears. I never thought I'd have a chance. Mama, James called from the steps. Come see our classroom. The classroom was everything the twins had dreamed of, bright and spacious, with new textbooks on every desk and a smartboard on the wall. Their teacher, Ms. Anderson, greeted them warmly. James, John, I heard about your letter, she said kindly. We have a wonderful creative writing program here. I think you'll both excel. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat at her desk in the church office, surrounded by the gentle harmony of hymn practice. Her computer showed a half-completed college application form. On her desk stood a framed copy of James's letter, Mr. Thompson had insisted on having it professionally framed, calling it the most important document in the Foundation's history. When she picked up the twins that afternoon, their faces were glowing with excitement. Mama, John burst out. I got chosen to help with a science fair project. And I got an A on my first writing assignment, James added proudly. Ms. Anderson said my story about hope was beautiful. That evening, as they sat around their dinner table, now always full of fresh food, Sarah listened to her boys chatter about their day. The sound of laughter filled their apartment, replacing the worried whispers of just a few months ago. Oh, James suddenly remembered something. Look what I made in art class, Mama. He pulled out a carefully crafted drawing of their family. But this time, it wasn't just the three of them. He'd added Mr. Thompson and Robert, standing beside them, all of them smiling. It's our family, he explained. Not just by blood, but by heart. Sarah hung the picture on their refrigerator, next to their perfect report cards from their old school. As she stepped back to admire it, she noticed something written at the bottom in James's improving handwriting. Dreams come true when hearts are true. Later that night, as the twins got ready for bed, now dressed in proper pajamas rather than old t-shirts, they stood by their window. The white mansion was still visible at the end of their street, but it no longer seemed intimidating. Instead, it glowed warmly in the evening light, a beacon of hope not just for them, but for other children who might need help making their dreams come true. James? John whispered, just like he had that fateful night months ago. Yeah. Are you happy? James looked around their room, at their new books and school supplies, at their mother humming in the kitchen as she prepared their lunches for tomorrow, at the picture on their wall of the whole extended family at last weekend's Foundation picnic. Yeah, he smiled. I really am. The twins climbed into their beds, still holding their new watches, the Academy's motto catching the light. Knowledge lights the way. Outside, the city hummed with its usual evening symphony of distant sirens and neighbors' televisions. But inside the Williams apartment, there was only peace, hope, and the quiet certainty that sometimes the purest dreams, carried on the wings of a child's letter and nurtured by newfound family, do come true. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching her boys drift off to sleep. They had always been her light in the darkness, her reason to keep going. Now they were blazing their own trail, lighting the way for others, just as she'd always known they would. Good night, my brave boys, she whispered. Dream big, and they did, their hearts full of tomorrow's promises and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest miracles come not from asking for help, but from being brave enough to speak the truth with love.